Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this episode of She's Got GAWL. This is our podcast for our West Georgia chapter of the Georgia Association for Women Lawyers. I am Ebony Phillips, your host, and I'm super excited because I'm joined by a woman who knows a lot about a lot of things, but she is going to focus us tonight on rent talk. So this episode is called Miranda Talks Rent. Everybody's been talking about rent and moratoriums and landlord's right and renters' rights, and you kind of hear a lot of chatter on the internet. But we don't want to get our information, especially about our rights, from the chat room. We want to get them specifically from an expert. And so we have with us tonight Miranda Jordan. She's an attorney in the West Georgia area. And I had Miranda's information. I thought, you know what? I'm going to let Miranda introduce herself because I'm probably going to leave out something important and significant. And nobody can introduce you like you, right? So Miranda, if you wouldn't mind, just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dive right into our conversation.
All right. Thanks, Ebony. Again, my name is Miranda Jordan. I am an attorney. I've been practicing for 4 years. And I do, Ebony knows we have to always do the lawyer thing. And I have to give a little disclosure here that I'm not offering legal advice to anybody in particular. And your situation is always going to be unique. So if you're out there listening and you're like, oh, okay, I'm going to do that. Feel free to ring me up and we can talk if you have an issue. I'm available for consultations, but this is just good general information. And I have gathered this information from sources like the Georgia Landlord Tenant Handbook and from the Georgia Code sections that apply to landlord tenant law. So that's where all of my knowledge comes from. I've been practicing, like I said, for 4 years, and most of the work that I do at Harrison Law in Douglasville is related to real estate in some way. Real estate closings, landlord tenant work, all kinds of things. Liens on real property, homeowners associations. So we're kind of a one-stop shop for all things real estate, and we also do general civil litigation as well.
Miranda, I think that, like I said before, you are the perfect person to help our viewers with this because you know all aspects of it. And that's what we really need. So we're going to do Miranda Talks Rent in a very informal way, very conversationally. And I will just remind folks of what Miranda said a moment ago. This is not intended to be legal advice. This is just general information that's available. And then, of course, if you find yourself in need of legal services, you should consult an attorney like Miranda, who can help you out with whatever your specific situation is. But let me ask a question, though, because you said y'all are a one-stop shop. So you do work for landlords and for renters, is that right?
We do, and unfortunately, in the state of Georgia, our laws are a little bit more landlord friendly. Unfortunately, if you are a tenant, that is. So a lot of the work that I do is actually for landlords. I do represent tenants on occasion if they have a case other than I just haven't paid my rent.
Okay. Okay.
Sometimes we can help people negotiate, but there's not a whole lot you can do in the state of Georgia if you haven't paid your rent. And we'll get into that a little bit further, but I do represent landlords and tenants. Just always kind of have it in the back of your mind that you may think you have a claim against a landlord and legally you don't, even if something that they're doing isn't right morally or ethically. Legally, what they may be doing is just fine. So that's kind of one of the reasons why I mostly represent landlords, because tend to really have more of a case with landlords.
That's a very good point, right? Because I know folks will say, but this wasn't done right, or they didn't treat me right, or they didn't address this particular situation in the right way. So now I want to take them to court. Now I want to sue. So I think the distinction between what's morally right, what's ethically right, and what's legally required is a good distinction to make. Miranda, I don't do real estate law, don't know a thing about it really. But I was hearing a lot about a rent moratorium. What is that all about?
Since March of 2020, or probably more like April of 2020, we all know what happened around that time. The world kind of turned upside down for a lot of people as COVID began to become really widespread. So there were protections in place by the federal government and even local and state governments to prevent people from getting evicted during a time where a lot of people couldn't go to work.
Okay.
They either couldn't go to work because they were sick, or they couldn't go to work because we were all supposed to be quarantining in our homes. Some people are fortunate that they could work remotely, and some people were not so fortunate. A lot of businesses were closed, restaurants were closed, shops were closed, and it takes a while to recover from that, even if you were able to go back to work within just a few months or
Right.
even a few weeks. It takes a while to catch up on bills sometimes, and you have to prioritize feeding your family. You have to prioritize keeping the water turned on, and sometimes for people, paying the rent was not a priority. So, and understandably at that point. So there were a lot of protections. Initially, the protection was if your landlord has a federally backed mortgage on their property that you happen to be a tenant of, then that landlord could not evict you. And that's because the landlord didn't have to pay their mortgage during that time. The federal government worked with loans that were federally backed to make sure that those homes would not go into foreclosure if the landlord wasn't receiving rent and therefore was not paying the mortgage on the property. That went away pretty quickly. That lasted a few months. But then another federal moratorium on evictions went into place vis-a-vis the CDC. And there was a lot of confusion back and forth on whether the CDC had even any kind of authority to
Now, when you
say
say
that.
CDC, you mean the Centers for Disease Control were
That's
it part
right.
of a rent moratorium? Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes. So the Centers for Disease Control used their federal agency authority to say it's a public health crisis. These people may not have anywhere to go. If they become homeless, then they're going to be either in shelters or they're going to be congregating with a lot of other homeless people. We don't want people to congregate because of the public health crisis. The other option is you don't have anywhere to go. Maybe you move in with a family member and you move your family of four into their family of four. And now you have a crowded family of eight living under one roof where COVID is more likely to spread, especially at the times when schools were starting to go back into session. So there
Right.
were a lot of reasons why the CDC had a stake in telling people whether they could just avoid paying their rent. But it wasn't quite as simple as that. So there was a form, and I say was because I'm talking past tense at this point. There was a form that had to be filled out. It was a CDC declaration, and you had to answer a few questions and you had to certify a few things. You had to certify that your income level was below a certain point. You had to certify that you had nowhere else to go, if or you would have to be going somewhere that was um, heavily populated, more crowded than where you currently were, in order to have shelter. And you also had to certify that you had exhausted all efforts to find rental assistance and had been unsuccessful in doing so. Once you turned in that CDC declaration to your landlord, legally, they were not allowed to pursue an eviction against you. If an eviction had already been filed, then they could not move forward with getting a writ of possession or just removing you from your home in general. And so that went on for many, many, many months. And actually, up until August 26th of this year, just a month ago, it was still effective. On August 26th, however, the Supreme Court of the United States said that that was not an enforceable mechanism. The CDC did not have the authority to put a moratorium on evictions. If there was to be a moratorium on evictions, that would have to go through the lawmaking process, through our Congress, or through state bodies, legislative bodies, to make that determination. And generally speaking, a lease or an agreement to pay rent in exchange for housing is not something that the government's going to interfere with, because it's a private contract between a landlord and a tenant. So
Right.
at this point, you haven't seen really Congress stepping into that role, certainly on a federal level, but you also haven't seen any of the state legislatures really put forth that legislation as well. So at this point, there is no moratorium. That could change at any time. We are in a society right now that one day you hear one thing, the next day you hear something else.
Right.
So that's one of the things that I wanted to kind of clarify on today's podcast, but also, um, you know, be willing and able to seek out information as it becomes available, because things are constantly changing.
So Miranda, the moratorium is over.
The moratorium is over.
Wow. And so what does that mean, like, for renters and for landlords? Because I know there's an emphasis on renters being displaced if they can't pay their rent, and understandably so. I mean, nobody wants to see people evicted or homeless or whatever. But what about also the landlords who depend on the rental payments to pay their bills? Like, where's the, I guess, where's the middle? Is there a middle? Is there a balance?
Well, fortunately, Ebony, there are a number of rental assistance programs that still are very much active and still very much available. A lot of times, tenants just don't know where to look.
Okay.
One resource that they can apply for rental assistance is through the United Way. And a really good idea, and it sounds very simple and very elementary, is a Google search to say rental assistance Georgia or rental assistance wherever you are. And there is government money that is available to help you catch up on your rent. So maybe you're working again and you're doing great and you're able to pay your bills, but you still owe rent from 6 months ago.
Right.
So you've been paying anything that you can, but you're still not caught up. That can allow you the opportunity to play catch up. And then now that you're working again, you can move forward with being able to, have a stable tenancy again, a stable occupancy of your property where you're paying every month. Most people just don't have the kind of money sitting around to catch up with 5, 6, 7 months rent that they couldn't pay during a time where school was out and they had to be at home with their children during the school day to do virtual learning, or various other circumstances. Maybe they were out of work for a long period of time because they were hospitalized with COVID. There's all kinds of circumstances out there. And of course, my heart always breaks for people when I hear their stories. Typically, though, I'm on the other side and I'm hired to represent the landlord. Now, a lot of times, you mentioned about what can landlords do. There's no revenue coming in. The courts are backlogged with cases to be able to address these evictions. And landlords can also reach out to these rental assistance programs and work in concert with their tenants to be able to get some money. So it's a win-win for both sides. Most landlords don't really want to put people out. They are not, contrary to popular belief, they're not monsters, but it is a business transaction. And a lot of times, like you said, landlords have to pay their mortgages. And if a landlord can't pay their mortgage, then they lose the house, and the tenant's still going to have to move out because the new owner is not going to let them stay there. So it's win-win for, that brings me to another point. It's win-win for landlords and tenants to work together on this issue. And sometimes that means landlords might take rent payments every 2 weeks instead of every month. That might mean that landlords are actively applying for that rental assistance for the tenants, even if the tenants are not super cooperative with that process. That might mean that the landlord agrees to a temporary reduction in rent by $100, or to waive late fees, or to waive any cost of collection or court costs. And those kind of things are going to help both parties move together in a positive direction. Sometimes that's not possible, and we all understand that. Sometimes a tenant disagrees that they should even have to pay rent because there's a maintenance issue in the property. And when you're dealing with the place where you sleep every night, there's a lot of personal feelings about that. So the best thing that you can ever do, though, is to set those personal feelings aside and say, how can we move forward in a positive direction with this landlord-tenant relationship? The other thing to think about is, right now, it's incredibly difficult to find affordable housing. So if you are in a place that charges rent that is within reason, that is a locked-in rate under your lease, the best thing you can do is do what you can to stay in that lease. Right now, I don't know, Ebony, if you have had the opportunity to look at housing prices for
Oh my gosh. Oh
sales.
my gosh.
And a lot of landlords are actively wanting to put out tenants because they think they can make more money with somebody else. So if you have a good relationship, and you can throw every penny you've got at your landlord and say, look, I want to be here. I'm working on this. Please don't put me out.
Right.
Do that, because it's only going to get harder if you have to find somewhere else to live.
So I want to circle back to two things you said. This is such great information. The moratorium. Can you tell I'm kind of stuck on that?
But it's a thing it's a buzzword we have heard for over a year now.
And to have somebody that I can actually ask questions to about it, who actually knows the answers, I'm taking full advantage here. But you said that suppose you're 5 to 6 months behind, and obviously you wouldn't be able to catch that up all at once. So the moratorium wasn't about the rent payments. It was about eviction. Is that right?
That's right. And you do bring up a good point that I left off earlier. It was about pausing the eviction process. It was not about saying you no longer owe this money. On the 2-page CDC declaration, it specifically says what this means is they can't evict you. It does not mean that you don't owe the rent. And that's where that rental assistance really comes in helpful. I represent a landlord in DeKalb County, and although the process has been slow, they did not shut down the courts, or since reopening back in the fall, or since late summer last year. There hasn't been a shutdown. There's just been a big slowdown. Counties like Fulton and DeKalb, which are the biggest counties in the state as far as population goes, they were dealing with a severe backlog of cases and are still working through those. But since one of those cases was filed, in the meantime, the tenants worked with the landlord, and they got back rent in like a year's worth of rent.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes. And they're caught up now. So all they have to do now is come up with current month, which is a lot more manageable.
Yes.
And I think on another note, when you think about okay, I'm just buying time at this point. I've got this moratorium in place. I'm not paying rent. My landlord is not evicting me. If it's not just a situation where you're like, oh, well, I'm going to take full advantage and I'm just not going to pay, which unfortunately that does happen. But if it's a real situation where you just can't come up with enough money to make all of the bills every month, then there are options out there for you, but it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming. And a lot of times when you feel stuck like that, you just freeze. You freeze in
Mm-hmm.
time. You you shut down. The fight or flight goes into effect, and you may either be the person that's googling every resource and every nonprofit you can possibly find, or you're going to be the person that just sits there and tries to run away from it. And
Right.
and that's a natural human response. Um, But going back to what I said earlier, the best thing that you can do in this situation is to be proactive, to work with your landlord, to seek out those resources. If you're not able to work and you have time during the day, you're calling every nonprofit you can find on the internet, you're filling out every form you can possibly fill out, you're talking to a local pastor, anything you can do to network and get
Right.
yourself some money to pay that rent, you know?
So Miranda, scenario. I'm a renter, and I've fallen on hard times. And you've just said that probably one of the things to do is be proactive. You mentioned earlier about working with the landlord because it's a win-win for both sides. Find something mutually agreeable, whether it's a rent reduction or whatever the case may be. How do I even start that conversation? Like this is it's a business transaction. This is not my friend. And I'm not living up to my end of the business transaction. So how do I even start that conversation?
Good question. So, depending on what kind of relationship you have with your landlord, if it's more of an informal relationship, if maybe they just have this one rental property, um, maybe you call them up. Maybe you if you're intimidated to call them, you can send a text message, but I caution people too much on putting some things in writing. Some things are good to put in writing. We know that as attorneys. If you have a solid agreement with somebody that I know I owe you $1,000, I can pay you, and that thousand was from September rent. So I
Right.
said I owe you September rent, for example, and I can't pay it all at once, but I'm doing good now, and I can pay my October plus an additional 200 towards September, and I'll add another 200 for each month until I pay you back. So for the next 5 months, I'm going to pay an extra $200 on my rent. That's one of those options. 200 can be a lot of money though.
Right.
So what you want to do is ask for help, but have a solution in mind, because that's
Mm,
that's the way that you want to reach out to somebody that, although it's a business relationship, you've got a plan. They're hearing you say this plan, and they're hearing, okay, I'm going to get some money. This person has an idea and this sounds good. Let's do it. Let's give it a try. Worst case, you got some extra money towards September rent, and maybe they kind of fall back on hard times around December. Well, money in the pocket is better than no money in the pocket.
right.
I have to
Right.
tell I have to tell clients that all the time, not even just landlord tenant cases, but any civil case where plaintiff and defendant are looking to settle,
Right.
or we haven't even gone to court yet, we haven't even filed a lawsuit yet, but how can we work this out? Well, everybody brings something to the table, and then we actually have something to talk about. Um,
Right.
Starting that dialogue. If you come in aggressive, like, look, I shouldn't even have to pay you because da 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 da.
That's a
It's
non-starter,
aggressive.
right?
That's aggressive. And landlord may shut down, and landlord may
Right.
say, I don't have to do you any favors. You're out of here unless you can come up with a rent by X date. But when you look at it and take the emotions out and take
Yeah.
the personal out of it and say, look, this is good for you. Because even if I screw up on this deal, you've still gotten my money up until that point,
Right.
you know?
Right.
So I think being able to be open minded about your own obligations and making it known that you are willing to meet somebody in the middle.
Which brings me to another question, because that's really good advice. Have a solution already in mind. And I think that goes probably back to your point about being proactive. But what if a renter is occupying a rental property and they have maintenance requests that have gone unresolved? They've called, they've written letters, they've talked to the landlord, talked to the landlord's representative, to no avail. At what
Good.
point, if
Good
any,
question.
and I'm going to say if any, because again, this is not my area, can the renter just say, at what point, if any, can the renter just say, you know what, until you fix that thing, I'm not paying any rent? I mean, obviously they could say that, but would they have legal um, grounds to take that position, or would they find themselves in a bit of a tight spot if they did that?
Yeah, great question. Because a lot of times you think, well, if I withhold their money, then maybe that'll get their attention. And in the state of Georgia, the law is that the tenant needs to give reasonable opportunity for the landlord to fix something. Um, the exception being is if it's an emergency. For example, it's a Friday and it's July and it's 95 degrees outside and the air conditioning goes out. So you send a little text message or an email or a phone call or a combination of those to your
Right.
landlord and say, hey, look, my air's out, like it's really hot. Oh, and my elderly grandmother lives here and
Right.
she's going to die if we don't get this air fixed. I might live, she may not. So
Right.
at that point, it's an emergency. And if they don't send somebody out that same day, then what you have the right to do as a tenant after you've given them that notification, and if they say, well, we'll send somebody out next week, and you have to communicate with them, well, that's not good enough. It's the middle of summer. We got to get this fixed. Generally speaking, most landlords are going to get that and they're going to get on top of it. But if your landlord doesn't, then you have the right to go hire an HVAC company to fix the issue and then pay them. And then you get to deduct that amount of money from the rent that is owed coming the next month. So, for example, your rent is $1,000 a month and the HVAC guy comes out and does his repair and it costs $600. So you turn in the invoice and the paid receipt to your landlord with your rent due for the next month. So you're deducting 600, which is what the HVAC cost, and you're paying 400, which is the remainder of the rent that would be owed. We call that repair and deduct. Now, if it's something like I something non-urgent, trying to think of a good example here. Um,
Maybe
maybe
there's
the
a
landlord
leak
is in
or
charge
something.
of having the grass cut,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and the grass is getting about knee high, and you're like, okay, landlord, like, hey, usually you have the grass cut every 2 weeks. Like, we need to have the grass cut. I'm afraid there's going to be snakes in the yard, and this just really needs to be taken care of. So that's not something where you could just immediately have somebody come out and cut the grass. You would need to give reasonable notice. There's no danger, there's no harm. It's just unsightly. And yeah,
Right.
there could be snakes and critters and rodents in there, but it's not something that if it's not taken care of that same day, it's going to be a problem. But if you give them reasonable notice, which reasonable is up for interpretation as well, then they still don't do anything, then you can have it done, pay the person to do it, and then deduct that from your rent that's owed the next month.
So just to clarify, if it's an emergency, even after I say it's an emergency and they propose a time frame that doesn't work for me, I still need to go back to them and say, hey, that doesn't work for me before I hire out somebody else to do it, right?
That's right. Because otherwise, you run into a situation where maybe just lines got crossed. Maybe they were working on getting somebody out there and they didn't respond to you, or they need to know, do you have somebody lined up that can come take care of this? Maybe the landlord doesn't know this company, but the tenant does, and they trust them. Then you don't want to get your lines of communication crossed. So you want to
Okay.
be very clear and say, look, that timeline that you're proposing, landlord, is not going to work for us because this needs to be taken care of right now. There's water shooting out of the wall, or our water line was cut, so we don't even have any water.
Right. Right.
Or something that can't wait more than 24 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Then make it very clear. Say, well, if this, we're considering this an emergency, so I'm going to have somebody come out today unless you think that you can have somebody out, but let me know in the next 30 minutes so I can make arrangements. And if you don't hear anything, then it's obvious that at that point you've given them the opportunity to come up with a solution, and they haven't.
Right. And so even with a non-emergency situation, though, a renter is not legally permitted to say, I'm just not going to pay any rent. You didn't do what I asked you to do. You didn't resolve my maintenance issue. I'm just not paying anything.
Correct. You cannot just withhold rent for trying to induce your landlord into doing maintenance. You can't just say, I'm not going to pay. Your option is to make the repair and then take that money away from what you would pay the landlord.
And if I decide I'm not going to pay the rent, then what action does the landlord have in that instance?
Well, they're going to give you a 3-day notice to either pay any past due rent or to vacate the property. And then if you don't vacate at that point, then the landlord would be forced to file an eviction in the county where the property is located.
And so I'm going to come back to eviction in a second, but what about when people, we've talked about, hard times, folks having to try to make it with less. They've lost a job, they've lost income, they can't work because they've got to be home with their kid. Whatever the scenario is, people are having to sort of be innovative, and for a lot of people that means moving in with other people, whether it's friends or relatives or whomever. And folks have been pretty kind-hearted and letting people move in with them and so on.
Right.
But what if the person overstays the agreement or overstays wears out their welcome, I guess people would say, many years ago. But whether it's overstays the agreement, it started out and it was working, it's not working anymore. The homeowner doesn't want them there anymore. Right. Or they're not following up with the agreement, because the agreement was you could stay here and you could pay a little something, quote unquote, right? I wouldn't charge you necessarily what market rate would be, because I know you can't pay that, you're on hard times, but you're not even paying anything. And so now I want you out. What's the recourse for that? Because I feel like if the person is already on hard times, chances are if they put the person out, they're going to be in a worse situation than they started. But by the same token, the other person may feel like they're being taken advantage of because now I've got this extra body or bodies, because sometimes people are bringing their whole family in my house, and that's increased utility bills, increased food bills, and just extra people in my house. So how does the law apply to that situation?
Well, anytime you have a written lease, it's typically going to say that the lease term is from this date until this date, maybe a 12-month period. The problem you get into with arrangements like what you're talking about is people typically don't have a written agreement. So, with no written agreement, how do you know if the person was supposed to pay money, how much money, how long were they supposed to stay there? And so they're considered a tenant at will. Tenant at will is basically it's the legal word for month to month tenant. You can be a month to month tenant if you don't have a written lease. You can be a month to month tenant if your lease has expired. And maybe the terms of the lease say at the end of this term, this lease will continue month to month unless the parties sign a new lease, for example. But basically, a month to month tenant is somebody occupying a property without a written lease in place. And in Georgia, if you are a month to month tenant, you are allowed 60 days notice. Your landlord has to give you 60 days notice to vacate the property. So I caution people, nobody wants to think that they let their best friend come stay and couch surf for a while and that they actually would have to evict them at some point. But it might be a good idea for the protection of your friendship and your sanity to actually enter into a short-term lease and say, then at that point you can say if either party wants to terminate this agreement, they have to give a 30-day notice or a 10-day notice, and there's a contract in writing that supersedes Georgia law. Whereas if I just say, hey, Ebony, you can come stay at my house until you get back on your feet. Well, that sounds to me like maybe a month or so.
Right.
Ebony might be thinking, oh, it's going to take me a year to get back on my feet.
That's a big difference.
That's a big difference. And so people often don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of talking business with people that they care about, but
yeah,
it's important to be on the same page when you enter into an informal agreement like that, and that you're living in somebody's home, or you're inviting somebody into your home, to set those ground rules, put it in writing, have both parties sign it and say, we agree that this will not, at this date, you will move out. Because when you're a tenant at will, when you're a month to month tenant, you're given a lot more rights than somebody who is what's called a holdover tenant. Mm-hmm. You'll see both of those things on an affidavit of dispossessory, which is what's filed to start an eviction. You'll see language that says tenant at will, and you'll see language that says holdover tenant. And a holdover tenant is, okay, I was given a 6-month lease to stay in this property, and the lease term has expired, and the lease says once the lease term expires, I gotta go. I don't have a month to month option. I don't, the lease doesn't continue month to month until one party terminates it. It's over, like it's done and over. Then holdover tenant does not have to be given 60 days notice. They're just staying beyond the term that the property was leased to them, or the agreement, so be careful. And I hate to tell people you need to get an attorney to have your cousin come stay with you, but it may be a good idea to at least sit down with, and be like, hey, no disrespect, but like, I want us to still be friends after all this, and let's go ahead and set some rules. How long is this going to happen? no wild parties, etc.
Right.
You want to still be friends and care about your loved ones when all of it's over, but y'all might drive each other crazy. So it's better to have that knowledge
Right.
in place and that agreement in place before you ever really proceed with the move in.
I think sometimes people, like you said, don't consider that part. You really kind of find out a lot about people that you didn't even know once you try to live with them. Good, bad, and different. You get a lot more information. And sometimes it's just certain people you can't live with. You could be the best of friends, the best of loved ones, but you know, sometimes it's just hard to live with people. And I think you're exactly right. If we don't take the time to iron out those details, we might find ourselves in a world of regret when it's all said and done. So
Right.
we're going to wrap this up because I feel like I've taken like 2 pages of notes here, but it all very good information. What is your advice though for somebody who's unsure about their rights as a renter? Is that when you say, okay, you need to call an attorney? Are there other things they can do? Because at the end of the day, I know sometimes when you're in that moment and your whole family is in a rental, space or whatever, and things are happening, you don't want to make a misstep because you might feel like if I make the wrong step, I could subject us to an eviction or I could subject us to whatever other things that there might be out there.
Right.
If somebody's unsure, what's your advice? What should they do?
Well, an attorney is always a good option, but we're expensive. We are. There are some great resources if you live in. Oh, let me get these counties right: Fulton, DeKalb, Clayton, and Gwinnett. I think are under Atlanta Legal Aid,
Okay.
um, and maybe Cobb. But if you look up Atlanta Legal Aid on Google, they have great resources. If you qualify for their services, you don't pay anything for legal services. And if you have a case that you need to fight, then immediately reach out to them or to the Georgia Legal Services Program, which deals with um, legal services for lower income individuals in other counties other than the metro, the couple of metro counties that I mentioned. But Georgia Legal Services Program and the Atlanta Legal Aid Services, those are great resources if you know that you're not going to be able to afford an attorney. Um, if you're not sure if you'll be able to afford an attorney, a lot of attorneys provide free consultations as well. Um, a lot of times if it's something that the attorney can't help with, they're going to kind of give you that quick rundown of like, you're going to have to pay your rent.
Mm-hmm.
Or they're going to say, you know what, let's have a deeper conversation about this. You may actually have a claim here,
Right.
but it's always good to ask. And you never know when you're going to call up that one attorney that is in a really good mood and they haven't done their pro bono work for the month and they want to help you out.
Right.
But
Right.
definitely reach out to Atlanta Legal Aid or Georgia Legal Services Program to find out if you qualify for their assistance. There's also resources that you can use to just get basic answers, but make sure if you go online and you're reading, like Ebony said, all of the internet is full, right? It's full.
Right.
Make
Right.
sure you're getting information about Georgia law because landlord tenant law is going to be different in every state. So make sure you're specifically reading and researching Georgia law only. If you're looking up statutes, if you're looking up the actual law itself, make sure you're looking at the most recent versions of the law, which is the code would be updated through 2021 at this point because the General Assembly for Georgia has already finished its legislative cycle for the year. So that's what you're going to be looking for if you're doing your own research on the internet or in a law library or something like that. The most recent version of the official code of Georgia annotated.
So Miranda, I took notes. So I want you to tell me how I did as we wrap up, right?
Okay.
The rent moratorium is over for now, at least. It's over. And
Correct.
even if at some point it applied to you as a renter, it paused evictions. It did not wipe out rent obligations. Is that
That's
right?
right. That's
Okay.
right.
If you have an opportunity and you found yourself on hard times, try to work with your landlord, if at all possible. Housing costs are astronomical right now. So if you're somewhere that is working for you otherwise, try to stay there. If you need to work with your landlord, be proactive and go in with a plan in mind. Don't just say, I need some help on this rent or I need a reprieve. Have a solution in mind, because that usually gets to the answer quicker. If you're going to let somebody couch surf, consider doing a short-term lease with that person. As impersonal as that might seem, that'll save you heartache in the end. If you have repair and maintenance issues, you cannot just out and out refuse to pay your rent because those are unresolved. You have to do and I wrote it, don't tell me, Miranda, repair and deduct. You have to do a repair and deduct. And if it's an emergency situation, you have to make it known to the landlord that you consider it to be an emergency. If you're unsure about your rights, you can reach out either to Atlanta Legal Aid or Georgia Legal Services. They have some resources. And I'm going to add Miranda Jordan to that. She would never do this, but I'm going to say you can also reach out to Miranda Jordan. She's wonderful, if you can't tell by now. She knows this area inside and outside. She could do it in her sleep if she needed to with her eyes closed. And I'm so excited that you were able to share with our listeners. I feel like this is such great information, because even for me, as somebody who works in the legal field, this is not my area. And you're right, the internet is full. And being full, a lot of times it's not accurate. So whenever we have the opportunity to hear from somebody who actually knows what they're talking about, we want to take full advantage of it. Thank you so much for being here. I knew this was going to be great. I didn't know it was going to be this great, but it's fantastic. And if anybody wants to reach your firm, do you have a website that they can go to?
The best way to reach me is definitely via email.
Okay.
Email is M as in Miranda Jordan, Jordan, at westgalaw.com. So shoot me a quick email. And we're actually going to be moving offices. We have a new office in downtown Douglasville that we'll be moving into about mid-November is our goal.
Nice.
So we will have information on our newly revamped website, which we'll be launching as well. And but we're going to be located in downtown Douglasville. We're really excited about moving into this little old house that we're renovating right now.
That's fantastic. I can't wait to see it. Well, we're going to sign off now. Thank you so much for listening. And until next time, this is your She's Got GAWL, West Georgia podcast featuring Miranda Jordan, attorney at law. Miranda Talks Rent.
Thanks, Ebony.